They mocked her broken leg. They called her useless. Then they dumped her in the desert night, bleeding, crawling, dying, until a lonely rancher with a ruined past found her and everything changed. The story is set in the year 1994 in the wide, unforgiving ranch lands of southern Arizona, in the unforgiving desert of I-94, where the nights cut colder than steel and the days burned hotter than hellfire. A girl named Alina crawled through the sand with a shattered leg dragging behind her like dead weight, every breath scraping her throat raw as the echo of their laughter, cruel, high, merciless, kept replaying in her ears, because they had called her lame, weak, worthless, beating her until her vision washed in red, stealing what little she owned, and leaving her broken at the edge of a dry ravine with nothing but moonlight and the taste of blood to remind her she was still alive. She didn't remember when she had stopped screaming or when she had started crawling, but she knew that if she stopped now, she would die, her bones sinking into the sand like thousands before her, becoming part of the desert stories told by travelers who vanished between dusk and dawn, and yet something in her refused to die. Maybe it was the memory of her mother's voice telling her she had a warrior's soul, or maybe it was the promise she made to herself the day her stepfather sold her to those cruel men, that she would survive long, enough to become something more than a victim. Her fingers dug into the ground again, pulling her body forward inch by agonizing inch as coyotes howled in the distance, and the desert wind stung her torn skin like needles. But she pushed on until the horizon blurred and the world tilted sideways, and she didn't know if the shadow approaching her was real or one more hallucination, shaped by pain. Yet she lifted her head and blinked through tears to see the silhouette of a horse, tall, dark, majestic, standing over her like a guardian spirit, and behind it sat a man, broad-shouldered, rough, dust-covered, his eyes filled with the kind of loneliness only decades of heartbreak could carve into a soul, and he slid off his horse with caution as though approaching a wounded animal, kneeling beside her without touching her, studying her face with a silent shock that battled with fury in his eyes, because he had seen people hurt before but never like this, never dumped like trash on land he swore to protect. "Who did this to you?" he whispered, voice rough as gravel, but she couldn't speak, her throat closed, her body shaking, and when she finally looked into his eyes, something in him changed, something deep and old and locked away, as though seeing her suffering cracked open a part of his heart he thought had died with his wife 10 years ago, and without hesitating he scooped her into his arms, lifting her weight with surprising gentleness, carrying her toward his horse while she drifted in and out of consciousness, feeling the warmth of his chest and the steady beat of his heart, the first human kindness she had felt in years. He placed her carefully in front of him, holding her steady as he rode toward his ranch, thousands of acres of land he managed in silence and sorrow, far from the world that had betrayed him, whispering to her to stay awake, to hold on, because he wasn't going to let her die. Not tonight, not on his land. And the desert wind rushed past them in a blur as he pushed the horse faster, praying under his breath even though he wasn't a praying man. And Alina tried to keep her eyes open, but the night shimmered. The stars stretched like streaks of silver, and she felt herself slipping, though somewhere in her fading consciousness she heard his voice, firm and desperate, promising that whoever hurt her would pay, that she was safe now, that she wasn't alone anymore. And as they approached the lights of his ranch, soft yellow glows, blinking like distant angels, she finally let her eyes close, trusting for the first time in forever that maybe, just maybe, fate had not abandoned her. Little did she know that her rescue would ignite a storm across the desert, dragging secrets out of the shadows, awakening enemies who thought she was dead, and binding her life to the lonely rancher in ways neither of them were prepared for, starting a story that would shake the very bones of the land and carve their names into its dust forever. The world returned to Alina in fragments, warmth, light, the soft rustle of curtains, as she drifted back from the edge of death. And when her eyes fluttered open, she found herself lying in a clean bed inside a wooden room that smelled faintly of cedar and medicine, her broken leg wrapped, her wounds cleaned, and for a moment she didn't know where she was or who had saved her until she heard slow footsteps outside the door, and the tall rancher entered carrying a bowl of steaming broth, his hat in his hand, his rugged face softened by concern that didn't seem to match a man used to solitude, and he paused, almost startled to see her awake, as if he hadn't expected her to survive the night. "Easy now," he murmured, setting the bowl down and pulling up a chair. His movements careful and gentle, like someone handling something fragile, and she tried to speak but her voice cracked, barely a whisper. So he handed her water and waited until she could breathe again, asking her name, asking who hurt her, asking how long she had been crawling through the desert alone. But her memories hit her like a storm, shouting, fists, pain, the word lame, spit at her like poison. Yet she couldn't bring herself to say any of it. So she simply whispered, "They left me," and the rancher's jaw tightened, as though he was fighting the urge to ride out that very moment and hunt down every man responsible. His name, she learned, was Cole Harrington, owner of Harrington Ranch, 10,000 acres of dust, fences, cattle, and silence, and the way he sat beside her made it clear he wasn't a man used to company. Yet something about having her there seemed to stir old memories in him, ghosts he forced down behind his eyes whenever they tried to surface. And though she was weak, she noticed the shadows under his gaze, the loneliness carved into his posture, the heaviness he carried like someone who had lost far more than he ever said aloud. The next days passed in slow cycles of healing and tension. Cole feeding her, checking her wounds, making sure her legs stayed elevated, never pushing her to speak, but quietly watching her as though trying to understand the life she came from, while outside the window the ranch stretched wide and endless, guarded by men who respected Cole too much to question why he suddenly had a wounded stranger inside his home. But whispers traveled anyway. A girl found crawling through the desert, half dead, bones broken, fate uncertain, and some cowhands wondered if she was running from something or someone. And Alina felt safe for the first time in her life. But she also knew safety never lasted, not for girls like her, and on the fourth night she woke with a scream choking her throat, visions of boots and fists and laughter tearing through her sleep, and Cole rushed into the room, grabbing her trembling hands, telling her she was safe, telling her no one could hurt her here. His voice rough but honest, and in that moment a bond began to form, fragile, hesitant but real, and she found herself wanting to trust him even though life had taught her that trust was a luxury she could never afford. Yet as she rested her head back on the pillow, she didn't see the shadow moving at the edge of the ranch fence, a figure watching the house with venomous eyes. A man who had been sure she was dead, a man who whispered to his companions, "The girl's alive, and she's at Harrington's place," in words that carried danger across the wind, because the men who had left her for dead were not finished, and they knew if she survived, their secrets wouldn't stay buried. So they planned to return under the cover of darkness to silence her forever. Meanwhile, Cole, unaware of the threat crawling closer, continued tending to her wounds, growing more protective each day, feeling a storm brewing in his chest that he didn't know whether to embrace or fear, because something about this girl, broken yet unyielding, awakened the part of him that once believed in saving people, the part he had buried after losing his wife. And though neither of them said it aloud, they both sensed that fate had pulled them together for a reason, far larger than survival. But the desert didn't forgive easily, and the past always had a way of coming back, and as the night deepened, the ranch lights flickered against the darkness, unaware that enemies were already creeping through the sand, ready to ignite a deadly confrontation that would test everything. Loyalty, courage, and the fragile bond growing between the broken girl and the lonely rancher who refused to let her die.